Hello, welcome to our webinar on pollution mitigation practices in agriculture, incentive practices and policies, brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural and Resource Economics. My name is Gal Hochman and I'm a CFAIR board chair and professor at Rutgers University. It is my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. Next. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Next. Before we get started, I wanted to provide some background on today's topic. Agriculture provides food for humans, fiber, and livelihood for billions of people worldwide, and is a critical resource for sustainable development in many regions. Regardless, agriculture also provides many ecosystem services and opportunities for climate change mitigation and removal of greenhouse gases. Our March webinar focused on the importance and significance of land management practices in reducing carbon emission. In addition, that webinar discussed the priority of introducing climate-smart agricultural practices on U.S. farms and ranches. In the upcoming current webinar, we will continue the conversation while shifting the focus from carbon to nitrous oxide and methane. Agricultural soils are a dominant source of nitrous oxide pollution, as is the management of manure or the burning of agricultural residues. However, what policy tools can we use to reduce these pollutants while supporting sustainable and resilient agricultural supply chains? Next. CFAIR has assembled a panel of 4 experts to discuss this work, starting with Jeff O'Hara. Jeff O'Hara is a senior agricultural economist in the Office of Energy and Environmental Policy. Jeff studies incentives and trends in the implementation of climate-smart practices on U.S. farms and ranches. Prior to joining USDA's Office of the Chief Economist in 2021, Jeff was an economist at USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. Next. Benjamin Gramick is a research agricultural economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, ERS, where he conducts applied research at the interface between agriculture and the environment. The majority of Ben's research is motivated by science-based decision-making and public policy, and is often interdisciplinary in nature. Next. Brent Overman assumed his faculty role with the Department of Biology and Agricultural Engineering in December 1995 at the Texas A&M Agri-Life Research and Extension Center at Amarillo, which is the hub of the United States' most productive cattle feeding region. Next. Stephen Wallander is an economist with USDA's Economic Research Service, ERS, with the Conservation and Environment branch. He studies behavioral responses to policies, the impact of contract structure and auction design on farmers' program participation decision, and the role of irrigation organizations for both water delivery and groundwater management, among other land and water conservation policies. Next. Before we start and learn from our panel of experts, we want to explain how to ask questions during the webinar to make sure you, the audience, knows how to engage. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing it into the box in the control display accessed by clicking on the question dropdown, as shown on the slide, and sending it to the organizer. Next. Now, I'll hand over the webinar to Jeff O'Hara, who will start us off.
Thank you, Carl. Next slide, please. Next slide. So, hi everyone. I'm here to talk about direct greenhouse gas emissions from U.S. livestock farms. I'm using the word direct to indicate that these are going to be greenhouse gas emissions that occur really from livestock farms exclusively, and not going to take into account the whole, the entire greenhouse gas emissions associated with livestock production, including land use impacts and emissions from cropping systems. But so in total, right now in about the US, about 4% of greenhouse gas emissions occur from livestock farms, predominantly of two forms. So enteric fermentation, this occurs mostly in cattle, and these are methane emissions that arise when cattle either breathe or burp out methane from their stomach. Now this occurs when during the digestive process, when they have plants and food in their stomach, and then microbes ferment those plants and food while they're digesting. Another 1% of total U.S. emissions occurs from manure management. There's two types of greenhouse gases that arise from manure. Methane occurs when manure is essentially decomposes anaerobically, which means without oxygen. So this would be like you have a large manure storage, facility like a lagoon, and a biogas would emerge from that, that would bubble up from that lagoon, and methane would escape that way. There's also nitrous oxide emissions that occur from manure, both urine and manure, from nitrogen. And then there's also can be greenhouse gas emissions from grasslands. Now, whether they're well-managed grassland systems where the animals are being rotated and they're not overgrazing, that can absorb or build soil carbon stocks. But when overgrazing occurs, then you can potentially lose soil carbon. Next slide, please. So this slide is a chart which shows which types of animals are responsible for which types of emissions. So enteric fermentation, we see there's almost about 180 million metric tons of emissions in the US. Over 70% of that occurs from beef cattle, and another 25% occurs from dairy cattle. So cattle are what are known as ruminants. They have this large stomach called the rumen, in which this fermentation occurs, and so that's why we see enteric fermentation predominantly occurring from cattle. To a lesser extent, it can also occur, in sheep and bison and other animals. Manure management predominantly occurs on dairy farms and also on swine farms. So there's about 60 million metric tons a year in methane manure emissions. And then we have about another 20 million metric tons in manure emissions from nitrous oxide, and that occurs both on beef, dairy, and swine farms as well. We can see there's fairly low greenhouse gas emissions from poultry. Poultry has low enteric fermentation emissions since they're not a ruminant and they don't digest food in the same way. And then poultry manure is more commonly used as a fertilizer, and so they have lower manure management emissions. Next slide, please. So what's the big deal about methane? Well, I think methane is, has gotten a lot of attention and focus recently. As a greenhouse gas, it has a short atmospheric lifetime of, approximately 10 years or so, and it has a high global warming potential. So it's much higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. I think we all know that there's challenges that we're experiencing as a society with reducing carbon dioxide emissions in the near term, and so there's a real interest in seeing if there's ways in which methane emissions can be reduced in the near term. So the U.S. Last year launched a global methane pledge in which they're seeking to reduce global methane levels by 30% in 2030 relative to 2020. California, the biggest milk producing state in the US, also has a methane reduction target. So, if you're really going to focus on reducing methane emissions, then livestock becomes really, really important. Next slide, please. So enteric emissions have gone up in the US in the last 30 years by 7%. Now, I think they've gone up as on a per animal basis, they've increased, but they've got at a decreasing rate. And so why this is occurring is we've seen incredible increases in productivity over the last 30 years. So taking Dairy, as an example, we've seen a 48% increase in U.S. milk production over a 30-year period, even though we have fewer dairy cows now than we did in 1990. So improving productivity has really improved the emission intensity of milk production and beef production. Unfortunately, with enteric emissions, the mitigation options are really, not well developed. There's one way to go about it is through drugs. There's a drug called 3-NOP, which has been approved in other countries, but has not been approved in the U.S. Preliminary research on that is indicating it can lead to fairly large reductions in enteric methane emissions. There is a drug called manure, which is approved in the U.S. And is fairly commonly used in the U.S., but the FDA has not approved it for the explicit purpose of reducing methane. There's also feed additives. Feed additives are a little bit different than drugs. They're not really used for treatment, but they're used to sort of enhance the quality of the food. But these sort of options are either not commercially available in the form of red algae, or in the case of nitrates, could potentially be toxic. Next slide, please. Manure and greenhouse gas emissions have gone up by much more than enteric emissions. So enteric emissions have gone up 70% over 30-year period. Manure greenhouse gas emissions have gone up by 62%. A big, largely driven, there are a few reasons why this has occurred. A big one, though, is that we've seen this big shift towards confinement systems as productivity has gone up. Again, though, like with enteric emissions, the rate of increase in manure emissions is not necessarily potentially at a lower rate or an equal rate as the increase in productivity as well. But for mitigation, I think the policies are more well developed, particularly in the case of anaerobic digesters. Anaerobic digesters can be implemented on a farm as a way of capturing biogas that's bubbling up for a lagoon. And then the biogas is either flared or combusted. If it's flared or combusted, that converts the methane into carbon dioxide, which has a lower global warming potential that we mentioned earlier. More recently, biogas on dairy farms is being injected into pipelines where it can be used as compressed natural gas and a transportation fuel. There's been some policies that have really incentivized the adoption of digesters. So USDA, as well as state agency, can offer grants for the construction costs of digesters. There's a variety of market incentives also available for digesters. These include renewable energy credits, greenhouse gas offset credits, and in more recent years, we've been seeing biofuel markets providing credits to dairy farms for producing, biogas, CNG from biogas. This would be the California's low carbon fuel standard and the EPA's renewable fuel standard in particular. Next slide, please. And so this slide shows that the number of digesters has increased by quite a bit in recent years. So there's now over 300 digesters in the U.S., at least manure-based digesters. And between 2018 and 2021, we saw about a 40% increase in the number of digesters through a combination of grants and also, market-based incentives in renewable fuel markets that have are providing high credit values. Next slide, please. And so the final slide is just to talk about policies available that USDA has to reduce livestock greenhouse gas emissions. There's funding, there's financial support for anaerobic digesters from USDA's Rural Development and as well as NRCS. The Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 has allocated new funding that will be available for climate smart farming practices, both on crops and livestock systems through NRCS conservation programs. There will also be rural energy and biofuel programs that are going to be supported through that as well. And in this past year, Secretary of Vilsack has announced a new program called the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. This is a program that will create new or expand existing markets for agricultural commodities produced with climate smart practices. And so we're going to see, I think there'll be some more information about this program announced later this calendar year. But the upshot is that we're going to see a lot more funding being used for going to livestock farms to produce to produce livestock with climate smart practices and market the resulting commodities. So thanks very much for listening to my remarks, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Very interesting. Now we will be hearing from Benjamin Gramick. Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gal. I'm going to talk about nitrogen, shift focus away from methane, which was the main focus of what Jeff just shared with everybody. Just want to keep the usual disclaimer in mind. This is Ben Gramick, PhD, talking to you, not any official government opinion or result. Advance the slides, please. So nitrogen can be lost to the environment in a number of different ways. This diagram that you're seeing here was lifted straight out of EPA's most recent greenhouse gas inventory. So the focus is around greenhouse gases and N2O, nitrous oxide in particular. However, it effectively shows the loss pathways for nitrogen into waterways as well, as we think about both water and air pollution as being the main focus usually of nitrogen pollution abatement in agriculture. The biggest sources that I'm going to talk about and focus on are synthetic fertilizer or inorganic fertilizers. Jeff just talked quite a bit about the connection back to livestock and manure management, and there are a lot of biological processes obviously going on in the soil and in crop residues and plants that are influencing exactly what's going on. But as you look at the little sort of patch of land down in the right corner, you see these different arrows coming up out of the land, and the width of those arrows represents the sort of relative contribution of N2O in particular, nitrous oxide to the air. That's why those arrows are going up into the air. But you can also see leaching and runoff in this diagram, right? Nitrogen moves through those and sort of as it cascades through the environment. And certainly the two biggest sort of pathways directly from land management and agriculture into water pollution are through runoff across the surface into lakes and streams, rivers, or leaching. So that can go directly into groundwater that you see here, or that could be into subsurface tile lines or drainage that usually ultimately ends up in surface waters. Next slide, please. Looking at the greenhouse gas side of this, this again focuses in on the emissions that are coming specifically from agriculture, not the gross U.S. emissions numbers that Jeff just shared. So if we focus in on agriculture, and I'm going to talk about N2O, not methane, CH4, or CO2, you can see that the majority, 57% of those emissions in the most recent year are attributed to nitrous oxide, N2O. And over to the right, what you see is an exploded sort of detail of those 57%. The biggest share, 53 of the 57%, come from what is called agricultural soil management, so direct management of agricultural soils, which includes those fertilizers I already mentioned, but also interacts with soil types and tillage and exactly which crops are being grown and other things to determine what that emissions profile looks like. Manure management is a smaller piece of this, as Jeff just spoke about. Next slide, please. On the water pollution side, looking at nitrogen, any nitrogen that is not essentially fully utilized by crops or whatever is growing in a farm field is potentially available for loss to the environment. And manure and inorganic fertilizers that I mentioned are those key sort of sources of those things. Right? There's not some immobilization of that nitrogen in the field, whether that's in soils or that's in vegetation, or it's harvested with crops or things that are taken off of the land, then typically any of that excess nitrogen is potentially available for loss, and that happens usually through rainfall or snow melt. It can happen through leaching that I just talked about a moment ago. The major concerns associated with this, or the major environmental problems that we tend to see talked about a lot, are eutrophication in lakes, basically excess nutrient enrichment of lakes and rivers, or places like the northern Gulf of Mexico where we have a large hypoxic or dead zone. Phosphorus, not nitrogen, tends to be the culprit, and algal blooms that are usually the focus of a lot of efforts. Next slide, please. Efforts to control ag nitrogen pollution. Now, what practices are available to try to address whether GHG emissions from agriculture attributed or traced back to nitrogen and water pollution? Typically, more or less the same kinds of practices. Usually the focus is around fertilizer management or fertility management more broadly than just the use of fertilizers. And in particular, what are usually referred to, or often commonly referred to, as the 4 R's. So that's about using the right rate of fertilizer, the right timing, the right placement, and the right source or form, the type of fertilizer that you have, if you've heard of the 4 R's. I'll talk about rate and timing a little bit more here in just a moment, but briefly, placement can be important, especially in terms of thinking about incorporation or broadcasting over the surface in terms of loss or the opportunity for volatilization into the air. And certainly source matters. There have been a number of technology changes or new technologies developed, including variable rate technology and precision application, as well as, and I won't talk about it in detail today, as well as expanded use of enhanced efficiency fertilizers and other nitrogen loss inhibitors that can be mixed with fertilizers when they're applied in order to try to immobilize those nutrients or delay their availability and potential for loss until the point where plants are actually able to uptake those nutrients. A non-fertilizer related practice that we're seeing a lot of interest in for a number of different reasons, but that also potentially has implications for nitrogen loss to the environment is cover crops, which have been expanding relatively rapidly over the last 10 years or so. The idea here being that if you can put a overwinter cover crop in place so you don't have bare soil in place in that field, it could potentially scavenge or recycle nitrogen that's there, hopefully kind of immobilizing it or holding it in the field and then make it available for the subsequent crop. Next slide, please. I'm gonna just quickly sort of show a few statistics or trends related to some of the practices I just mentioned. The first one here is just looking at the rate, the first of those 4 R's that I just mentioned. Fertilizer application rate, so this is pounds per acre by crop, where you see corn is in blue here, then you've got cotton and wheat as the 3 crops that tend to have the highest demand or input usage related to nitrogen in particular. As you can see, this goes 1990 up to the most recent year for which you had data readily available. We haven't seen a big skyrocketing increase. We haven't seen a big decrease for any of these crops. Corn is often talked about a lot because it uses relatively more nitrogen than some of the others. But what we have seen that you're not seeing in this graph is an increase in nitrogen use efficiency over the same time. A really pretty dramatic improvement in yields. That's attributed to a number of different things, including seed technologies, planting densities, a number of other things that are going on, as well as management in the field over time. But as nitrogen use efficiency has increased, we haven't really seen a decrease in the rate over time anyway, if we look at these trends. Next slide, please. Also of interest there was timing, right? The right time applying the nutrients when hopefully they're maximized opportunity to be taken up and used by plants. The biggest changes that we have seen over time, this is just a plot that looks at corn for several recent years that we have ERS data. One of the biggest changes in timing has been a shift away from pre-planting spring in application to post-plant application. This looks like a relatively small sort of change here, but there have been continued sort of trend in this direction in more recent years, with more of that nitrogen being put down when plants are actively growing in the field rather than when soil is still bare and the plant isn't actively demanding as much of that. And next slide, please. And the last thing I wanted to point out or talk about briefly, very briefly, is that all of these practices, whether we're talking about the fertility management or we're talking about something like cover crops, which is highlighted here together with tillage, they're part of a system. And whenever a farmer considers changing or altering that system and the practices that they're using, there are always follow-on impacts, right? It's going to shift timing of other applications or other field operations, and so there's a lot of sort of dominoes in place that can be triggered if you make some of these changes. And the other practices that they're using are going to influence things like timing. So in particular, the one thing I would highlight here is that while cover crops are only on about 7% of cropped acres, this is for corn and cotton. In the most recent 2 years, we had data available. As I mentioned, that's increasing. On cover cropped acres, though, we see really a considerably higher rate of post-plant nitrogen application, as well as reduced or lower rates of fall applied nitrogen being put in place. So some of these things are changing, and it matters what other practices people have in place. Next slide, please. And it's my last slide. This has the citations for some of the research that I cited in the data sources. Thank you very much, Gal.
Thank you very much, Ben. And we will have all these links accompanying our YouTube video that will be published for everyone to see and for others to view about a week or so after the event. Just before we go to our next speaker, I want to remind you, the audience, to feel free to ask any questions you might have through the question tab, and I'll forward it to the speakers following their presentations. So thank you again, Ben. And Brent, the floor is yours.
Very good. Let's advance the slide, if you would, please. Jeff did a good job of highlighting some of the magnitudes of methane being produced by livestock. My comments today will focus primarily on beef cattle. Where I sit in Amarillo, Texas, is the hub of the cattle feeding industry. Roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the cattle on feed in the United States are within a 2 hours drive of where I sit today in Amarillo, Texas. The primary beef cattle feeding states are Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Iowa, California. State of Washington is good sized, Arizona good sized as well. So a lot of beef cattle on feed produced in the western United States, with the major concentration in the Great Plains. What you're looking at here shows just 5 of the different ways that the different production components of the beef cattle value chain can be assembled to produce from a calf a finished animal that goes to slaughter at the packing plant. So a couple of different stages here. The calf is weaned from the cow. It can go onto wheat pasture, let's say, in the winter time in the southern high plains. Wheat pasture tends to be a great place for cattle to put on weight with high protein wheat vegetation in the field. It's also a place for us to overwinter cattle because of our relatively mild climate down here compared to where some of these cattle may originally be produced. So wheat pasture is an important, or small grain pasture, winter pasture. You might even generalize it further to winter pasture. They can go directly from there to the cattle feed yard, or they can go back and forth with native grass pasture or improved pastures, or modified, I guess is a better term, modified pastures into which we have planted specialized grasses and forbs and so forth to try to improve the nutritive capacity of the land. Anyway, these different production schemes, they can be used for different sized cattle, different production segments. So you've got the cow-calf, where the calf is with the cow for a period of time until the calf is weaned. Stockers, which tend to be yearling aged cattle. Backgrounders, these are cattle that are going to go to the feed yard, but we need to move them from a completely forage-based diet up to a higher concentrate diet. and we need to do that slowly so as not to affect their health, impair their health or productivity. And then the cattle feed yards themselves, where cattle are fed relatively high, what we call concentrate rations or diets. A high concentrate meaning a high percent, relatively high percentage of grain, usually corn, occasionally sorghum or small grains. Cattle feed yards, with respect to methane production, direct enteric emissions. Again, remember that Jeff's comments were directed at direct emissions of methane. If you compare the feed yard, a day in the feed yard to a day on grass, you will find that the feed yards generate considerably less enteric methane than the animal on grass, and that's because of the relative digestibilities of the two feedstuffs. When you expand that to include all of the emissions, not just the direct enteric emissions, we bring in additional sources like the cropland used to produce the corn or concentrate or cereal grains that are fed to the animals, and the transportation emissions associated with moving corn, let's say from Iowa or Illinois down to the Texas High Plains, let's say. Those transportation emissions are also lumped in with what we might call a life cycle. Next slide, please. In addition to the methane production, enteric methane production, the water consumption also varies widely with the production system. Beef cattle themselves drink on the order of 10 to 15 gallons per head per day of water. That's not a terribly large amount in the grand scheme of things. In confinement, the grain they are fed may have been irrigated or not. In the Texas High Plains, for example, we do have some irrigated corn, but we ship in by rail at least 2/3 of the corn that we feed to cattle in the Southern High Plains. So all of the feed bills that go to these animals in the feedlot are also associated with the not only the methane and other greenhouse gases generated by the cropping system upstream, but also the water that has been used to raise them. So much of that water, of course, is coming naturally in the form of rainfall on dryland cropping systems or rain-fed cropping systems in the Midwest. Here in the Texas High Plains, we have a hard time growing corn without supplemental irrigation. So again, it depends on the sourcing of the cereal grains that are fed to these animals in confinement. The picture you're looking at here is an example of what happens in the wintertime. We grow hard red winter wheat down here in addition to other types of wheat, but the kind of wheat that's typically used for overwintering these cattle is hard red winter wheat in the general case. The cattle find it very, very palatable, and they put on weight nicely, and it happens even through the snowy portions of the year. So that pertains to cattle that end up being in confinement, generally speaking. Cattle that are produced in an extensive mode, that is on ranches and pastures and so forth, we're getting 7 to 20 inches of water per year in quote free water. It's not terribly much down here. In addition, the winter pasture on which some of these feedlot destined cattle might be growing during the winter time may also be irrigated in order to ensure good vegetative growth early in the growing season, so that when the cattle are turned out onto wheat pasture, there's plenty for them to eat. Next slide, please. I'd like to point your attention to some of my colleagues at Colorado State University. I've provided to the webinar organizers a link to the AgNext organization at Colorado State University. This institute is directed by Dr. Kim Stackhouse Lawson, and they are rapidly building a lot of partnerships across a lot of the state, the land-grant universities that specialize or that have major programs in feeding beef and dairy cattle. and they, over time, AgNext will be a tremendous resource for information, advanced information on not only the emissions themselves, but the mitigation practices and how those are implemented on farm or on the feedlot. Let me stop there, and I'll be ready for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Brent, for your interesting conversation and this presentation. Have Stephen talk about policy. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So like Ben, I'm an economist at USDA's Economic Research Service, and I'll be, framing this with an economist viewpoint, giving a broad overview of conservation policy in this area. Next slide, please. So with that sort of economist's perspective, we really kind of divide things into two big silos. We're thinking about what are our options for encouraging pollution abatement on agricultural production systems. There are the voluntary approaches, and then there are the regulatory approaches. And for any sort of pollution policy, these are the two things we tend to be looking at. In the agricultural space, most of what's happening is on the voluntary side. The two biggest pieces of that are coming out of USDA programs. First of those is the USDA Conservation Technical Assistance. And so that's really providing information, expertise, planning, sitting down with the farmers and the ranchers, going through their complex systems and coming up with solutions to a variety of problems, one of which would be the pollution concerns. Some of that technical assistance results in plans that then get put into a pipeline for financial incentives. So most of these are through the working lands programs, the idea being to keep the land in production, but still abate that pollution and provide an incentive cost share, paying a portion of the costs of implementing the practices that are identified in the planning phase. Those are both voluntary. The farmers have to come and the ranchers have to come to the agency and really heed the call for participation in a given sign up for one initiative within those programs. There are the parallel options. Jeff mentioned some of these earlier. There are cap and trade. And then I put this under the voluntary side. It's actually kind of a hybrid approach. The cap is typically going to be regulatory, but whether or not a given ag producer wants to be brought into that system is a voluntary decision. If they want to, they can come in under these sort of baseline and offsets and get some credits, and then they are brought into that system. But under the initial setup of the regulations that drive everything, agriculture is not directly covered under the cap. There are also the more purely voluntary things, which are the non-governmental organizations or commodity buyers. These are the voluntary offset programs. They might be sustainable sourcing programs. Sometimes now they're referred to as insets. You talked about the sort of climate smart commodities earlier. And so the idea here is to leverage some of those relationships between the buyers of commodities and the producers or other key stakeholders and go beyond just the government programs. On the regulatory side, there is a bit here. For greenhouse gases, it tends to be more under the water quality side, and it's those nutrient cycles that kind of tie the two things together. On the federal side, you've got the Clean Water Act. The combined animal feeding operations, if they're large enough, they're going to come under that as point sources. The other aspect of it that might apply are these total maximum daily load requirements. Those will not directly bring agriculture under the umbrella of the regulation unless the state somehow in implementing those, in addressing those, decide to bring agriculture in. Now, the other piece of that is there's a lot of variation in terms of the regulation that's going on at the state level. Quite a few states require nutrient management plans, and some have restrictions on nutrient management and manure management. Next slide, please. So let's take a bit of a closer look at those two USDA pieces of the puzzle. That financial assistance piece, which we'll look at first, has gotten quite large overall. It's now about $3 billion per year You can see this growth over the last few decades. In the late 1990s, most of that conservation funding was going towards the conservation reserve program and retiring environmentally sensitive cropland and putting appropriate covers on it. Now, a little over half of the funding is going towards these working lands programs, mainly the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. EQIP is oriented a little bit more towards getting producers to adopt practices for the first time, to get them to really change something in their system. The Conservation Stewardship Program is a little more oriented towards sort of raising the bar and getting them to put what are called enhancements on those practices, sort of putting in a better version of those practices. So they really, in a sense, kind of work in tandem together. They also focus on a little bit different areas sometimes depending on the initiatives. In terms of nutrient management and greenhouse gas related practices, you've already heard about a few of these key things. The written nutrient management plans or comprehensive nutrient management plans are very important. The ones that are paid for into the program are often much more involved. A lot more work goes into them than some of the ones that are required under the state regulations. And so there's much more prescriptive aspect of those, diving deeper into some of the nutrient management pieces. You heard about the manure management side, digesters being an important piece of that. Manure storage facilities are another one. Under CSP, an important practice is precision nutrient application. Part of what Ben was talking about on getting that fertilizer in the right place at the right time, having that variation even within fields can be really important. In the irrigated sector, an important aspect of rice production is the potential for methane emissions. And so having proper irrigation water management, maybe moving towards alternate wetting and drying, can potentially reduce those emissions. So those are just a few examples of the dozens that are covered under these programs. Next slide, please. So for any one of those practices that are covered under the financial assistance side of things, or even under the technical assistance side of things, there's this question of what are the impacts going to be on the environmental outcomes of interest, right? The programs themselves are very much oriented towards a practice focus, prescribing particular practices in the plans, incentivizing particular practices through the cost share payments. What does that mean in terms of the outcomes? Ben previewed a bit of this in terms of overall trends for the sector, looking at application rates and application timing. This is from a report by my colleague Roger Clausen. And the idea here was, let's look at a few of these practices and let's compare what's going on the farms that have adopted the practice to a carefully selected control group of farms who haven't adopted the practice. In this case, they were looking at comprehensive nutrient management plans. They found that about 10% of farms have these written comprehensive nutrient management plans, predominantly done with USDA assistance. The impact of them having adopted those compared to that group of farms who had not adopted them is that you have a very large reduction in fall application of nitrogen, going from about 13% of farms to about 1% of farms. And that corresponding increase in that post-planting nitrogen application. So one of the factors driving that trend we looked at earlier is this financial assistance and technical assistance related to this planning. Next slide, please. Now I want to close by looking on the technical assistance side of things, right? Remember, this was under that voluntary side of the policy. So the farmers and the ranchers have to identify something, some concern on their farm that's going to make them come in and ask for assistance from USDA. And so we had a recent this year, my colleague Andrew Rosenberg was lead author on that. I was on that also. And we asked farmers, do you see any of these resource concerns on your fields, and have you gotten technical assistance for it? And the piece I'm highlighting here is that about 20% of major crop fields have identified poor drainage as a self-identified concern, something that they might come into the office for, right? Turns out if you're looking at something like N2O emissions on cropland, a really important driver of that is not just the nutrient management and the nitrogen applications, It's also whether or not the field has good drainage. Of those fields who identified poor drainage as a resource concern, only about 1/5 of those have received NRCS technical assistance to help address that poor drainage. So there still are important opportunities for the programs to target the assistance and to expand the assistance. So next slide, please. I'll just close with a couple of links here. If you're interested in following our reports, seeing our daily charts of note or the tweets that let you know when the reports have been released, you can find these on the ERS website. And next slide, please. If you have any questions about the reports I was talking about in the presentation, here's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Before we wrap up, we encourage all those that enjoyed this webinar to sign up to our newsletter, where you will get more information on a similar event online at cfair.org. A recording of this webinar will also be made available on our website and YouTube in the coming week or so. We also have a podcast series, Get a Grip on FAIR, which we recommend you visit. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions through information@cfair.org. Any question or inquiry, we'll be happy to respond and try to help as best as we can. And do follow us on Twitter @cfaircon. Next, please. A quick, an important quick word of thanks to our partners. This and other CFAIR programming wouldn't be possible without the continuing support of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, AAEA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistical Service, NASS, and USDA Economics Research Service, ERS. Next, we want to offer a big thank you, a really big thank you to you, the panelists, for a very interesting conversation during our lunchtime. We also want to thank you, the audience. We're passionate about this subject and think you are too, but it's not a small thing to plan to give up an hour of your time to spend it with us. We hope you enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed hosting it. Thank you so much and have a great day.